Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, and welcome to the second day of the Asia Pacific consultation on the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women, Achieving Gender Equality and the Empowerment of All Women and Girls in the Context of Climate Change, Environmental and Disaster Risk Reduction Policies and Programs. I now have the pleasure of introducing the moderator for our third session, Mr. Mozaharul Alam, Regional Coordinator of the Climate Change Program at the UN Environment Program. Mr. Alam has over 10 years of working on climate change with UNEP in Asia and the Pacific. Mr. Alam, please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Chane, for handing over this session. Dear distinguished participants, good day to you all. I'm Mozaharul Alam. You have already heard. I'm working as a regional coordinator for climate change program for Asia and the Pacific region. I will be moderating first part of the session, and my fellow colleague Branwin from UNDRR will moderate the second part of the session. First of all, on behalf of United Nations Office for the Disaster Risk Reduction and United Nations Environment Program, it's my immense pleasure and privilege to welcome you to the third session of Asia Pacific Regional Consultation on the sixth session of the Commission on the Status of Women. The overall theme of the regional consultation is achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and the disaster risk reduction policies and program. Our session is on women as actors of climate change, environment management, and disaster risk reduction. Across our region, women are at the forefront of climate action, biodiversity conservation, and reducing disaster risk. We all know the adverse impact of climate change, environmental degradation, extreme weather events, and the disasters on women. Yet they still do not have adequate representation in policy and the decision-making processes. More must be done to value, promote, and amplify women's voices, agencies' participation, and leadership. We need to also ensure the full and equal participation and the leadership of women at all levels to climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction governance, as well as in the design, management, reducing or resourcing, and the implementation of gender responsive disaster risk reduction, climate change, and environmental policies, plans, and the programs. This also requires us to support, invest in, and utilize women, the diverse knowledge, the skill, and the capacities to support these aims. Now, in the context of the ongoing review and the stock-taking exercise of international policy framework, including the midterm review of Sendai, the framework for disaster risk reduction, it is vital that we call for a stronger focus on gender equality and the women's empowerment to accelerate our collective progress. This also necessitates the equitable and the meaningful participation and the leadership of women-led organizations, as well as the gender ministries and the national review and the assessment process. In this session, we aim to learn from our distinguished speaker and the panel members on what enables women to act as agents of change, what obstructs them to take action in dealing with the climate change, disaster risk, and environmental degradation, and how should support the women and who should support women and the women organization in this area. We have Chandni Joshi as our speaker, and also the three panel members, Sharon Bhagwan Rolls from Fiji, Miguel Mongsi from the Asean Secretariat, as well as Van A from the Vietnam. I will introduce each of the panel during the session. Let me start with our speaker, Chandni Joshi, who is current chair of Women-Friendly Disaster Management Group in Nepal and the former regional director of UNIFAM for Asia, South Asia. Madam Joshi is the 26 years of the National Civil Service, the 18 years of the International Civil Service, and the recent 12 years of the freelance work has enabled her to possess a remarkable blend of multifaceted and the multidimensional development experiences, spanning all levels, micro, macro, and the meso level. So it's my pleasure to invite Chandni. Over to you, Chandni.
Thank you. A respected moderator, fellow panelists, and distinguished participants, and His Excellencies and Her Excellencies. A very good morning. Today I'll be speaking on women as actors of climate change, environment management, and disaster risk reduction. If we look at the existing gaps and challenges, we see that despite women being at the center of climate change, environment management, disaster risk reduction, and their contribution often goes unrecognized. Due to the unavailability of sex disaggregated data, the gender responsive approach is often ignored and missed out. The burden of unpaid domestic work and care economy deprives women from taking up leadership roles. And the patriarchal mindsets and impunity underestimates women's capabilities of being climate change agents. The environmental degradation impacts women heavily, as she is responsible for the fuel, fodder, water, and food for the family. Women are all aware that climate change and disaster impacts women and men differently. We are all aware of that fact. It is only the women's agencies which amplify women's voice and visibility and showcase them as climate champions, but they are constantly facing the dearth of funds. Therefore, national policies are often gender neutral, which misses out on the gender responsive approaches and forgets and undermines women's empowerment and women's equality issues. Now, I'll be sharing some learnings of the Women-Friendly Disaster Management Group as a best practice today. Women-Friendly Disaster Management is a network of 11 organizations working as a core group with 200,000 members, including single women, physically challenged women, LGBTQI, women home-based workers, women facing violence, Dalit women, along with lawyers and media group. In order to advocate for the rights, voice, and visibility of excluded women, which generally gets missed out, we came up with the women-led emergency response, and we called it the Charter of Demands, within 2 weeks after the mega earthquake in Nepal in 2015, which was widely disseminated nationally and globally. And it became a piece of accountability that everyone looked at. As climate champions, women led unique initiatives after the disaster. For instance, community kitchen for the whole village itself, daily hot meal for months for the vulnerable, women-friendly relief packages, not just food items, but women-friendly essential goods, and initiated model warehouse for DRR facilities in advance, because everything happens at the 11th hour, as we know the deadlines. National dialogue of hundreds of affected women was organized with duty bearers to showcase their strength, resilience, and capabilities to deliver. I remember the first day, they were all crying and telling us their sad stories. The second day, they said, we can control our lives. But the third day, they said, we can lead the country. So that kind of resilience they had. Women-friendly spaces especially were created by women's agencies for a safe space to breastfeed, change, wash, because women had not had a bath even for a month. Those kind of issues were coming up. And the psychosocial counseling was very seriously taken. And there were vigilant groups just watching out that there was no violence against women and trafficking doesn't occur. And the jumpstart of livelihood was initiated in these safe spaces. The capacity building of women-friendly disaster group members to train grassroots women on DRM with training of trainers and GC training modules, because the capacity building has to go in packages, not as one instant way. And here I want to put on record that WFDM has been able to showcase these results with the consistent support and encouragement from UN Women Nepal since the last 7 years. Now I'll be sharing a few recommendations for way forward so that we can create positive impact collectively. Advocate for women's inclusive and meaningful leadership in committees and decision-making fora at all levels. And in Nepal, especially now, we are having the elections. Using gender statistics in disaster monitoring, preparedness, and response. And advocate for sex desegregated database. Unless that is there, sound women-friendly policies don't come out. Advocate for gender and climate change and DRR issues to be integrated into the planning and programming processes, again, at all 3 levels. Women need to be informed about DRM-related existing laws, the new laws in being, their own rights, government programs and schemes, available information, resources and services, and of course, technology. And women have to be viewed as agents of change, as champions and leaders, not only as victims and survivors. That is what generally humanitarian aid does. Tailor training according to their needs will encourage women's participation, build their capacities. Women's contribution should be recognized and accounted for in the national accounting systems, resulting in women-friendly plans and programs at the national level, federal level, and local level. Frequent sharing and dialogue with women's group ensures that gender and climate change agenda is owned by the women's movement and women's group. Women's agencies need to be prioritized, and they should be allocated significant human and financial resource. And here I want to emphasize that unless you invest, you can't anticipate results. So if we want to achieve climate justice, you have to invest in women's agencies. Last but not the least, create enabling environment for gender mainstreaming at all levels consciously has to be done. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Chandni, for highlighting the different pieces of the puzzle, including highlighting the gaps as well as learning. And what you have mentioned, the resilience are very, women are very resilient and they have the ability to lead. So dear participants, now let's move to our panel discussion. And before I ask them question, allow me to briefly introduce each of the panel members. We have Sharon Bhagwan Rose, is a 2nd generation Fiji Island feminist and the regional manager of the Shifting the Power Coalition. Her works today support 23 diverse Pacific Island women leaders and the young women to enhance their collective power, influence, and the leadership to redesign systems and responses to disaster and climate change. Our second panel member is Nguyen Van A, who has more than 20 years experiences in development work, including the various areas such as agriculture, forest, natural resource management, the value chain analysis, as well as the climate resilient livelihood development. Currently, he is managing different projects of CHASE, the organization covering women and the gender related issues. Our third panel member is Miguel Monksny, He is a senior officer in the Poverty Eradication and the Gender Division, Human Development Directorate of Asean, the Socio-Cultural Community Development in the Asean Secretariat. Previously, he served as a senior officer in the Disaster Management and the Humanitarian Assistance Division in the same department. So let's welcome all the panel members in this discussion. So what I'd like to begin with you, Sharon. As currently we all aware of the disaster is happening in the Pacific, and the Pacific is on the front line of the climate change, environmental disaster risk. So my question is, how are women using knowledge and technology to support action to deal with climate change, environmental degradation, and the disaster in the Pacific? Over to you.
Thank you very much. Thank you for this opportunity and all protocols observed. So yes, even before the COVID-19 pandemic, we were indeed living with a climate crisis and another crisis, which is the lowest level of women's political representation, both in parliament, local and community government, and traditional systems of decision-making. And I think that's really important to understand, not just the how, but also the why in which women have led a variety of responses. And we've been organizing to redesign the table, including disaster management systems in line with human rights treaty obligations, such as CEDAW and other policy commitments. So part of the journey within the Shifting the Power Coalition actually goes back to 2009, when I was part of the co-creation of the Women's Weather Watch model in Fiji. It evolved from a simple SMS platform for rural women on our second island to become an innovative information communication system that monitors disasters and storms, but also provides information in real time to women in their communities, and then collects information from women to be an advocacy platform to enable them to be part of the decision-making in disaster management and humanitarian relief efforts. And this really became a very interoperable system as well, but it was designed to look at technology from the needs and perspectives of what women wanted, what women used. Now, this model's now been adapted through the Shifting the Power Coalition, with ActionAid Vanuatu leading the Women, Wet and Weather platform. They're currently in operation since the weekend, tracking what has now become TCWI. But what this has started to do is actually also support young Ni Vanuatu women to learn about weather patterns, understand the reports from the Bureau of Met, and then to develop early warning messages across the islands. And we saw that during Cyclone Harold, and then adapted in the context of COVID-19. So coming together as a coalition, we've also then been able to support partners in Papua New Guinea, develop Mary Got Power, Mary Got Information. So this is really about a journey from 2009 to 2021 that shows that when women are supported to work together, to have the technology, to understand and have the resources, we can lead in developing inclusive early warning information and communication mechanisms that are more than just about the weather. It's delivering accessible information to communities to get better prepared, and as well as in health emergencies, and to serve as a reminder of gender equality. Because like you said, with all the commitments with the Sendai framework, etc., we still need to keep reminding people, don't let go of women's rights and gender equality. So I guess for me, you know, when I talk about redesigning the table, it's redesigning information and communication systems to ensure they're appropriate, accessible, that they are not just seen as something that's fast and trendy like social media platforms, but really valuing public and community platforms that's accessible in content for local language. And ultimately, you know, it must be about sustaining these efforts that are women-led. Thanks.
Okay, all right. No, thank you, Sharon, highlighting the role of the technology and also the effort to scale up. I think this is important message that I am hearing from you, and how the women are leading that. So thank you very much for sharing the experiences from you from the Pacific. I may come back to you with the follow-up question, but let me move to the channel. When you are working in the local NGOs and working directly with the local people. So in your view and experiences, what needs to change in access to finance and technology? And we have heard from Sharon about the technology for women empowerment and the local organization working to build the resilience in their communities. So it has the follow-up on the technology and the finance part. So over to you, Van.
Thank you, Mohazaron, and thank you all the participants. I have a very good opportunity to share what we learned and what we done so far, because your question refers exactly to what we have done under the Empower program. In the program, we work in Bacan and Lao Cai province. That's a two poor province to support women business in mountainous area to have a better access to finance and technology. In this case of our work, technology here means renewable energy technologies like solar drying for agriculture product. There have been different issues related to your question. Firstly, women in the community at the beginning of the project, they not yet experienced with renewable technology, and they dare not to invest to renewable technology for their agriculture production. But after our piloting some model of drying agriculture product, for example, we pilot a model of mushroom drying for a women-led business in Bacan, and after that, quite a lot of women recognize the value and benefit from this technology, and they wanted to get a loan to invest in the renewable technology and drying technology. However, the second issue is that no loan program available from the bank and local institution for women to invest in renewable technology. We have worked with local women union to set up and pilot a loan program, and after its success, quite a lot of women interested and they want to borrow the loan for their work. And women union in one province already make a plan to ask the local government to support their loan program. I think this is difficult with some poor province like in Bacan, and I think we need to support at the central level of government. Related to services, very limited capacity of local service on solar drying. And then we have a link woman and also local service to national level of service. And they involved in the whole process of installation. And from that, they learn and build their capacity. So refer to your question specifically, I think to have a better access to finance and technology, we need to pilot and build capacity of women, link them with the local and national service of renewable technology. But I think the most important is that we need to have a more work with national level to share the information between CSO and central bank and national government policy, so they can have a more responsive loan and policy for women. That's very brief related to your question. Yeah.
Okay. No, thank you very much, Van. So you are bringing another aspect of women empowerment and connecting it, the technology, the financing, the technology, and supporting the livelihood of the women in agriculture. And we know the Vietnam has a larger contribution in agriculture sector. So thank you very much. So similarly, I may come back to you if we have enough time to the second round of the question. So now let me move to the third panel member, who is from the ASEAN Secretariat. Now, Miguel, you have heard the different aspects, and panel member also highlighted the need in terms of the policy area, the financing area. So my question is, what policies and the programming approach have successfully promoted and supported women's engagement and the leadership in the climate change and the DRR action in ASEAN through the ASEAN Secretariat initiatives? So Miguel, over to you.
All right. First of all, thank you for the opportunity to share the perspectives and insights from ASEAN in this regional consultation. To answer the question, let me start by saying that, ASEAN has consistently placed a high-level political commitment to advancing gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls. And this commitment is reflected, in the constellation of ASEAN political declarations adopted by the ASEAN leaders. One of the most significant is the Declaration on the Gender Responsive Implementation of the ASEAN Community Vision 2025 and the SDGs. This declaration really provides a clear mandate to integrate gender perspectives in the work of ASEAN. Now, in terms of strategy and policy coherence, ASEAN also fully recognizes how gender equality, DRR, and climate change intersect with other issues, and how crucial it is to ensure women's voice, agency, and participation in addressing those issues. So, for example, the ASEAN Comprehensive Recovery Framework articulates a clear mandate to integrate gender perspective strategies and approaches in recovery measures and processes. Also, the ongoing development of the Regional Plan of Action on promoting women, peace, and security in ASEAN is articulating this nexus between WPS and DRR, among others. Now, to translate that commitment into action, there are several policy frameworks, work plans, and platforms that, when combined together, provide this much needed space for women to fulfill their transformative roles. So we currently, ASEAN just recently launched the ASEAN Gender Mainstreaming Strategic Framework, which embodies ASEAN's vision and goals in mainstreaming gender. Also, we have a specific platform or body that's called the ASEAN Committee on Women, and they're currently implementing their work plan, which has a clear outcome area on gender responsive climate and disaster resilience. Now, there are so many other examples of strategies and policy programs. For example, in the disaster management sector, we have the ASEAN Committee on Disaster Management working with ACW, and they have a technical working group on protection, gender inclusion. We have the agriculture sector, who has adopted their guidelines on mainstreaming gender in the sector also. And I think, circling back to your question, partnership really has been a strategic approach in promoting women's engagement in climate change and DRR. And we see a lot of examples of, I think one of the panel discussants already mentioned the Empower program, which links national actions with regional outcomes, building capacities, and really generating knowledge and evidence for policy development. We also have engagements with civil society organizations such as the ADMIR Partnership Group. It's a group of civil society organizations that programmatically engages ASEAN on DRR and disaster management. And I see in the list of participants, we have representatives from the ASEAN Women Entrepreneurs Network. So they're a coalition of women entrepreneurs who really engage ASEAN processes, not just in pushing and widening spaces for women entrepreneurs, but really articulating this nexus between the needs of the private sector, gender equality, and the role of women in recovery, especially in the pandemic. So I think with those points, we clearly see the insights and perspectives from ASEAN on strategies and approaches to promote the women's transformative role as agents of change. So I think I'll end my intervention on that note. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you very much for highlighting that what you are doing at the strategic level, but also mentioning the importance of the partnership. And this is one of the area we have also heard from our the speaker, Chandni Joshi. Now, hearing all of you three, so I'd like to, as well as Chandni, so maybe I will go back to you, Van, because Chandni talked about the unpaid work of the women and the burden. We have heard about it. So the Van, as we are working directly again with the people on the ground, could you please tell us your experience in terms of the women's unpaid work burden? And then it is compounding, obviously, the climate change, the environmental degradation and disaster issues. How is the intensification of the unpaid care and the domestic work impacting the resilience, and specifically the participation and the leadership of women in this effort? Because in one hand, we are talking about we need the leadership, we need their participation, but we have also heard this the unpaid work, and it is also increasing. So how to handle that from your experience, Van?
Yes.
Maybe very quick, huh? In a minute or two maximum.
Yeah, thank you, Maharazun. Yes, unpaid and domestic work for women, I think, is very popular in the issue in our community where we work. From our experience, in normal case, women paid also around 50% of their time about unpaid and domestic work. So that means around 30 to 40% more than men for unpaid and domestic work. But the problem is exactly as presented by Chandni, unrecognized contribution of the work of the woman in the development. All the community, including men and women, always they see this is duty of women, and this is not heavy work. Yes, that's what they mention, but actually because of those work, women have no time to participate in the training, capacity building, and to get a better job. Our research we have done when we asked 150 women in different provinces, and they said that less than 3% of the women join training for the period of 3 years. Less than 3% for 3 years. So you can see that all their work limited their participation and capacity building. So during the COVID-19 social distancing, we did a quick research and rely under the Empower program. We rely that more work for women, but when we ask them who can help them with that work, and everybody, all the women say that my grandmother or my daughter, and really no one said, oh, my husband or my son. So it's very clear, evident that climate change, degradation of environment, increase unpaid work for the women. And of course, this is limited and impact their participation and leadership of women.
Okay. No, thank you very much. It's basically what you were sharing, that when we talked about the capacity building, their participation, this work is also impacting the participation. But thank you very much for sharing the experiences. So I'd like to go back maybe very quick to you, Sharon. You talked about this, the technology and empowering them in terms of strengthening their capacities to deal with the disaster. So is there other way of strengthening them, their capacity, including, I don't know whether that technology is bringing some income for them, but what are the other way of strengthening their capacity and the livelihood? We have heard from Vietnam.
So one thing I think is really about making sure that the women on the front lines of the climate crisis are actually determining and redefining what resilience means for them. And it comes back to that information communication system, as well as the being platforms for engagement. I also think it's really important, we can't talk about women's livelihoods without actually thinking about the reforms of how resources are allocated, and how do we shift women from the informal or microeconomic level to the floor of managing, for example, the resources. So having access to natural resources, not just sitting at the market, but actually managing agricultural production and supply chains that brings them social protection. So this really needs a feminist funding model that we have been developing with our partners across the 6 Pacific Island countries. That means getting funds to women when and how they need it. And finally, I think, you know, we're heading towards CSW, so we can't talk enough about equal participation. We've got, you know, the Generation Equality Forum, Action Coalitions. We need to look at the triple nexus, the peace and security, the humanitarian nexus, so that when decisions are made, we're not just saying, oh, we're going to do this only because we've had a disaster, but taking into account all of the local expertise, all the traditional knowledge and innovation that women bring to the table. And we hope that, you know, at CSW66, member states open the UN doors for women to be heard as well. Thank you.
Okay. No, thank you very much. I think the main point that I'd like to get from you is not the excess, but also giving them right to manage. I think this is one of the things that I'd like to just get from you. I'd like to just go to you, Miguel. You have talked about the instrument, how this can actually go beyond the intergovernmental to the governmental coordination mechanism, but better support the meaningful participation in women organization, because in ASEAN, it is the intergovernmental process, but how to bring the women organization in the process when you're setting up different policies and the action plan. If you can just reflect, maybe just in a half a minute, maximum a minute.
Yeah, thank you. You know, ASEAN has been characterized as a labyrinth, no, or a maze that needs a lot of time to navigate, no. But I think from what I shared earlier, there is really a potential to seize and utilize all of the mandate provided by the ASEAN regional frameworks, and there are many of them, and also to widen and strengthen consultative platforms at the national and ASEAN levels to ensure effective stakeholder engagements in policy dialogues. And that's where we really need a lot of investment of resources. And I think one last point is there's really an opportunity, to jointly create knowledge, evidence, and data information to inform policy development. And one concrete example of this is ASEAN's partnership with UN Women and UN Environment. We are currently at the final stages of developing the assessment of the state of gender equality and climate change in ASEAN. So I think those are the approaches that can really fully support and ensure the meaningful and substantive participation of women's organizations in ASEAN mechanisms, platforms, and processes. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Now, this is very, very end of our session, and it was very, very lively and very informative, the discussion that we have had. So I'd like to just give maybe less than a minute, but obviously maybe 15 seconds to half a minute maximum to all of you, just to tell us one key messages that you would like to see and reflected in this consultation. So let me start with Chandini. One key message.
Thank you so much for this opportunity again. Well, by listening to everybody, I think the whole thrust is it has to be conscious efforts in terms of women have to get access to. We heard about researchers, we heard about sharing, we heard about experiences, we heard about saving time and device for her. So she has to get access to information, resource, and services.
Thank you. Thank you. So I'd like to just go to Van Yu. If you'd like to say one key message, what should be that?
Okay. In our community, we need to identify a woman champion who can lead in the community for changes and can inform the local policy maker to change their policy and process to be more responsive to the woman need.
Thank you. So let me go back to Sharon Yu.
Thank you. If we want transformative local action, we need local, innovative, transformative work happening. We need to build on what the feminist and women's rights movement offers, and we need to really focus on how to ensure there's inclusion at the local level, particularly with women of all diversities, with a focus on young women, because this is about their future when it comes to the climate crisis. Thanks.
Thank you. Miguel, one key message, what you'd like to say?
Yes, thank you. One key message from me is that we really need to engage women's organizations and seize this opportunity policy space to engage various stakeholders and really invest time and resources to help one another generate evidence, develop policies and programs that amplify the voices and agency and participation of women. Thank you.
Thank you very much. With that, I have seen some of the questions coming. I'm also mindful about the time. We need to move to the second session, part of the second session of this, the discussion. I will request my colleague Branwyn to consider if the time permits to also take some of the questions. And I will request all the panel members and the speakers, please stay with us. We may have further opportunity to come back to you as we are receiving some of the questions. So with that, from my side, I would like to thank all of you for very, very lively discussion and the suggestion and the recommendations that you have put forwarded. With that, it's my pleasure to hand over to my colleague Branwyn to run the second part of the session. So over to you, Branwyn.
Thank you very much, Babu. Kia ora koutou, everyone. My name is Branwyn Miller, and I'm the Gender Advisor for the United Nations Office for Disaster Risk Reduction. After that compelling presentation and panel, it's my great privilege to moderate this plenary discussion for session 3 on the theme Women as Actors of Climate Change, Environment Management and Disaster Risk Reduction. This morning's plenary discussion for the final substantive session will run for the next 45 minutes. Government representatives are invited to share their experiences, and this will be followed by perspectives from other stakeholders. As we have limited time and would like to hear from as many stakeholders as possible, we ask that all interventions please be kept to no more than 2 minutes. We have a clock on the screen to assist with timekeeping, and we also invite submission of written statements if you have more that you would like to share. In the guidance note for participants that was circulated in advance of this meeting, we invited expressions of interest to intervene. We have accepted these on a rolling basis in the order of receipt by the Secretariat. I also invite you to request for the floor using the chat box, and I see those requests coming in, sharing your full name and country or organisation. We will invite interventions by government representatives first and chronologically as per the order of requests received. Please note that where a member state or organisation is represented by more than one participant, we kindly ask that only one representative requests the floor during this segment. We will prioritise participants who have not yet intervened. Thank you very much for your understanding. I now open the floor for government representatives. And just to note that interventions will be audio only. We request that you unmute when given the floor, and please note that your camera will be disabled. First, I would like to invite Ms. Hope Peasley, Assistant Secretary, Safety and International, Office for Women in the Department of the Prime Minister and Cabinet in Australia. Ms. Peasley, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Ms. Miller. I would like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the land that I'm meeting on today and pay my respects to all elders past, present and emerging. Today, we've been discussing how women's leadership and meaningful participation are absolutely critical in tackling the challenges arising from climate change environment management, and disaster risk reduction. Prevention, preparedness, response, recovery, and reconstruction efforts are more effective when decision makers represent a cross-section of society. Australia values the women's action and leadership in building resilience and enabling integrated response to climate change and disasters. Domestically, Australia provides funds to the National Rural Women's Coalition to advocate on behalf of rural, regional, and remote women across Australia, including on climate change, a key priority for them. Australia also supports women's leadership across the region. We have committed $50 million to the Disaster Ready program, which fosters women's engagement in disaster preparation across the Pacific and Timor-Leste. For example, in Fiji, women help map churches and other buildings as evacuation centres, train as volunteers and support child protection activities. We support the Women's Resilience to Disasters program to ensure gender equality, diversity and inclusion are reflected in prevention, preparedness and recovery policy in the Pacific. And we support Women's Weather Watch, which alerts communities about natural disasters through 3,000 women connected by phone across the islands of Vanuatu. We're also pleased to provide funds to the Women's International Network on Disaster Risk Reduction, which empowers women working in disaster risk reduction to enhance their influence and attain leadership roles. Today's discussion will deepen our understanding of the opportunities and challenges for women in climate change, disaster management, and disaster risk reduction, and ensure we can contribute to good outcomes at Commission on the Status of Women meeting. Thank you, Ms. Miller.
Thank you very much, Ms. Paisley, and for speaking within the 2 minutes as well. It's much appreciated. I would now like to give the floor to Ms. Lucille Apis-Overhoff, Assistant Secretary for Climate Change in the Department of Environment, Climate Change and Emergency Management for the Federated States of Micronesia. Ms. Apis-Overhoff, the floor is yours.
Thank you. Excellencies, esteemed guests and colleagues, warmest greetings and respects to you all. FSM is prone to natural disasters and human-induced climate change impacts and disasters which are degrading our environment, food, water, health, and livelihoods, and disproportionately impacting the vulnerable members of our society, such as women, children, senior citizens, and persons with disabilities. Hence, an underlying goal of our climate change work is to build climate resilience so that our people, including vulnerable and marginalized people, can continue to sustainably live on our 607 islands permanently. To this end, our programs and projects which are linked to the SDGs include development and implementation of the following: climate change policy, FSM nationwide integrated disaster management and climate change policy, joint state strategic action plans for disaster risk management and climate change, gender policy, climate change gender strategic action plan, climate change gender analysis report. Okay. I think it's important to mention that we also have a 2-year zero interest loans for small micro enterprise programs, of which a minimum of 50% of loans are given to women in business. We also have a proactive human rights task force, Family Protection Act, ratification of FSM CEDAW 2004. FSM is also closely working with the UN multi-country office in Micronesia, which has been recently established. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Apis-Overhoff, for sharing these perspectives from the Federated States of Micronesia. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Ms. Saloni Pradham Singh, member of the National Planning Commission for Nepal. Ms. Singh, the floor is yours.
A very good morning from Nepal. Can you hear me? Am I audible enough?
Very clear. Please proceed.
A very good morning from Nepal, the home of a huge range of Himalayas, which is very vulnerable and being melted. As the panelists said, investing on women and capacity building for transformative leadership is very, very crucial for responding the issues that we are talking about. And I do agree with the with the panelists, a very good friend, Sharon Bhagwandas Rose, that we need to redesign the table, not only the table, that we also need to set the priority agenda for the change. And also would like to support the recommendations put forward by dear Chandni Joshi. Now I would like to share some of the initiatives that has been led by government of Nepal. We now only agree that women are champions of community-based resource management. We do have examples of more than 40,000 forest users groups, which is led by women, and same with agriculture groups, water resource management groups. There are mother groups all over the country who've been leading these issues. Huge women leadership within those groups are coming up to conserve, protect, and also preserve the natural resources, at the same time addressing the DRR issues. Huge connection in environment conservation, climate adaptation, and disaster risk reduction and recovery is actually started and being led by women, which has been also reflected in the leadership capacity development programs of the political leaders. Women-led adaptation actions such as watermills, tunnel farming, women-led enterprises, cooperatives, saving credit groups, community-based water risk reduction, community farming, drip irrigation, community seed and gene bank conservation, conservation of water bodies and ponds, irrigation, bio-briquette, rainwater harvesting. All these things are very ably led by women at present. Therefore, government has also designated gender focal persons in each and every government institutions. Capacity development, sharing and conservation utilizations of use, traditional knowledge of climate change adaptation, environment conservation, and disaster has also been recognized and led by women. However, I agree with the panelists that unless we have a conscious effort to have them on board with required financing, we cannot sustain this process. Therefore, for transformation and sustained sustainable address to these issues, we need to have women and marginalized group who are very much prone to the disaster risk and climate risk. We need to bring them on the forefront as leaders with resources and capacity. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Ms. Singh, for sharing those important perspectives from Nepal. I'm very pleased now to hand the floor to Ms. Kaya Khan, Additional Secretary for the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change for Bangladesh. Ms. Khan, the floor is.
Thank you. Government of Bangladesh is fully committed for equal rights, gender equality and opportunities for women and men, which is included in the Constitution of Bangladesh. In the Article 18A of the Constitution contains the provision for the protection and improvement of the environment and safeguard of natural resources, biodiversity, wetlands, forest and wildlife for the present and future citizens. Our Honorable Prime Minister Sheikh Hasina is serving as chair of the Climate Vulnerable Forum since June 2020 and played a very crucial role as one of the influential leaders at COP26. At present, we have 5 female ministers in the cabinet. The Deputy Minister of the Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change is one of them. Yesterday, you have already heard about different policies and plans of Bangladesh on gender and climate change and gender budget. We also have climate budget for 25 ministries and division as well. Different projects are ongoing by the ministries, including Ministry of Environment, Forest and Climate Change, to achieve gender-responsive, climate resilient, sustainable development. We'll be happy to know that Bangladesh has achieved 6.94% growth this year, despite of COVID-19 pandemic. However, as one of the most climate vulnerable countries, this trend of development will be at stake if we cannot have adequate climate finance for our climate vulnerable communities. Moreover, we need gender lens investment in our climate project. In this regard, donors and funding organizations can take necessary steps. Data generation and proper accounting measures will also be needed in this regard. Women entrepreneurs should be supported in the green business and sustainable energy. We will need to further enhance our women's resilience to climate change and their participation in decision making and also in climate negotiation. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Khan, for sharing great perspectives from Bangladesh we can all learn from. I'm pleased next to give the floor to Ms. Perada Fumesewati, Department of Women's Affairs and Family Development for Thailand. Ms. Fumesewati, the floor is yours. Thank you.
Thank you, Madam Moderator, and thank you for all panelists for your fruitful discussions. Bringing the voice and listening to women's and girls' experience is a foundation for understanding the gender implications of climate change and accelerating women participation. Thailand attached to these foundations and initiate methods to bring the voice of women and their experience. Annually, we create a supportive forum to Women National Assembly for bringing their voice and experience into policy formulation. Furthermore, the issue of climate change is needed to be simplified. When we talk about climate change, it tends to be considered as a scientific and technology issue, but we all realize that its impact on social and economic life of people, especially women. To simplify the concept of climate change, for example, Thailand adopted an innovative way by bringing women's voice and day-to-day experience on climate's impact through their photography. This method helps to simplify the issue of climate change and create an understanding of this issue in a practical and powerful way to put women into the heart of the climate action. Furthermore, the normative work must be reformed by bringing a comprehensive gender lens into climate actions and DRR. For instance, we launched the handbook on gender responsive disaster management. New method to challenge the economic structure is also needed to climate actions. For Thailand, the bio-circular and green economy model, or BCG economic model, was adopted as a part of our national agenda, where we need to boosting up women participation as an agent of change into this economic model. Above all, collaborations among all sectors to dismantle patriarchy is a key. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing these perspectives from Thailand. I'd like to now call on Mr. Mujtaba Ghafouri, Department of Environment and Sustainable Development for the Ministry of Foreign Affairs for Iran. Please, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair. Can you hear me?
Yes, loud and clear. Please proceed.
Thank you so much, Madam Chair, for giving the floor, and good morning and good afternoon, all distinguished representatives. In the name of God, at the outset, I would like to express my deep gratitude to the Secretariat for its able leadership and the critical role in organizing this significant meeting. Madam Chair, the Islamic Republic of Iran highly values the key function that the women and girls could play in achieving sustainable development goals and its full realization in general, and addressing the climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs in particular. In this regard, and for sharing our experience, I would like to say a remarkable number of women in Iran work at the senior management level and have a high-ranking position in the environment department. Furthermore, we have had 3 times a woman as the vice president and the head of the environment department of the Islamic Republic of Iran, actually at the level of minister. Madam Chair, due to the necessity of comprehensive global response to the climate change and environment problem, we strongly believe that these international crises cannot be defeated without resorting to the joint efforts of all men and women in a spirit of multilateralism, cooperation, and solidarity. We all need to tackle and pay due attention to impediment impairing national and international endeavor in this regard, the unilateral measures which infringe and deprive nations, particularly women, of financial resources and essential facilities and infrastructure is the most pressing challenges in this regard. Regarding our viewpoint mentioned, I would like to conclude that the renewed commitment to multilateralism is urgently needed. Thank you.
Thank you very much. We have concluded our interventions from the floor from government representatives, and I now open the floor for non-government participants as well as representatives from UN entities. First, I would like to invite Ms. Ramchat Wacharatanan Kornkul, Office for the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much, Madam Moderator, for this opportunity to share the recommendation from Office of the UN High Commissioner for Human Rights. Dear distinguished participants and dear colleagues, women, including many indigenous women, possess knowledge, skills for effective environmental stewardship and action. However, many women have taken action to protect lands, water, nature, communities, and human rights from environmental harms and climate impact, often at great personal risk, facing criminalization, silencing threats, stigmatization, violence, and even death. And Asia-Pacific region has been ranked as one of the most dangerous regions for environmental human rights defenders. OSCHR calls states to respect, protect, and fulfill their human rights obligations to women environmental human rights defenders. These include guaranteeing their rights to expression, assembly, association in virtual as well as physical space, and participation in decision-making at the local and international levels. It also requires ensuring rights of redress and accountability for threats and harms against women environmental human rights defenders in order to protect them. OSCHR also calls states to undertake gender-responsive capacity building, awareness and monitoring efforts, and institute affirmative measures to overcome traditional barriers to participation experiences by women and persons with diverse gender identities, and to ensure that they are active participants and leaders in environmental action at all levels. Such measures should include ensuring gender balance and adequate gender expertise in environmental negotiation teams and effective participatory process that include women and their representative organizations in all their diversities when crafting environmental laws and policies. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Kun Ramchat. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Mr. Manoj Dinakaran, Officer for Research and Projects, Hibiscus Foundation for Social Welfare, an NGO and youth organization in Chennai, India. Mr. Dinakaran, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Chair, for this opportunity. Honorable guests, greetings from Hibiscus Foundation for Social Welfare. We are a youth-led, women-led, non-for-profit organization from India. We as an organization have come up with our 5-point recommendations that are as follows. Point number 1, we are willing to focus on accessible mental health infrastructure and assistance targeted at women in the context of disaster mitigation and adaptation to prevent incidents of abuse and tackle mental health emergencies in local and regional levels. These include who are at risk of domestic violence related to increased stressors during post-climate disasters. Guardians or caregivers need to be trained on sensitivity with regards to climate and gender. Education of mental health professionals on climate literacy is also essential. Access to education in the context of women is also essential. We should also focus to reduce girl dropouts due to chronic and acute impacts of climate change. In this regard, we should also include curriculums that are climate and gender sensitive and inclusive in both schools, colleges, and universities, and to maintain this accountability. We should also bring one-stop crisis centers providing women and girls who are at risk, victims of climate disaster, with free and immediate access to medical attention, psychological counseling, legal aid, shelters, and other support services. In regards to toolkits and research, we need to create a disaggregated dynamic database on gender-related post-climate disaster data, including but not limited to caste, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, place of birth, displacement status, disability, civil status, and income. Formulation and provision of national level accessible resources and toolkits, including grassroots level education campaigns, are also to be included. A fourth point, make it mandatory to have a plan of action for management risk related to gender impacts of climate risk in climate management policies are also required. Finally, equal representation of population in the context of race, caste, ethnicity, religion, sexual orientation, gender identity, age, place of birth, disability, civil status, and income. The formulation of climate action policies are to be mandated. Thank you so much for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Dinakaran. I'm pleased now to pass the floor to Shamala Chandrasekaran from Arrow. Shamala, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Madam Moderator. I'm Shamala Chandrasekaran, representing the Asian Pacific Resource and Research Center for Women, Arrow. Most countries in Asia and the Pacific are vulnerable to climate risks and disasters, and many countries in the region are located at the top of the most vulnerable countries in the world, according to the Global Risk Report assessments. Globally and nationally, policymakers, scientists, researchers, and civil society advocates are working towards developing climate change mitigation and adaptation action plans. Unfortunately, until the last few years, women have largely been missing as key actors in the climate negotiations, and gender considerations in decision-making is still not a priority for some governments. Echoing other speakers, the impact of climate change is not gender neutral. Gender-differentiated vulnerabilities arise from social status of women in society, less access to resources, poor representation in policymaking, and low skill and knowledge levels. The disproportionate impacts of climate change on women and girls in all their diversities include the lack of access to sexual and reproductive health services, increase in early child and forced marriages, gender-based violence, social and economic marginalization, barriers to access to education, and many more. These impacts are a manifestation of gender inequality, which is only exacerbated by gender-blind climate solutions. Women and girls experience marginalization of their SRHR during the times of climate-related disasters and humanitarian crisis because of SRHR is least prioritized in humanitarian settings. Even when they are provided, they tend to be limited to a few maternal health-related services. Arrow studies from South and Southeast Asia have highlighted problems such as relief kits not including gender-specific essential supplies, inaccessibility of contraceptive services due to damages to roads, bridges, or broken communication channels, cyclone shelters not inclusive of gender-specific needs of privacy. It is important to incorporate gender considerations and gender-responsive approaches in planning and implementation of climate change resilience and disaster risk reductions. This would include assessing climate risk from a gender perspective, institutionalizing mechanism for hearing perspectives of women and girls in all their diversities, recognizing equal rights of women as stakeholders in the planning and decision-making process, equitable sharing of the benefits of climate finance and action priorities, and gender-responsive monitoring and evaluation. Thank you, Madam Chair.
Thank you very much for sharing those important perspectives from Arrow. I'm pleased now to give the floor to Mrinalini Rai, Woman for Biodiversity. The floor is yours.
Thank you so much. Just following up on the inputs I provided yesterday and also the colleague from OCHR, just to also reiterate once again the important link that environment or the biodiversity discussions that are going on will impact all the work that we are talking about today. This will have a rippling effect on other processes. So I just would also like to just reiterate the importance of a recent resolution from the Human Rights Council on the right to a healthy environment and sustainable environment. And in that, it also states that to adopt policies for the enjoyment of rights, including with respect to biodiversity and ecosystem, and also to must also fully respect other human rights obligations, including those related to gender equality. These links with environment, we really need to see these links again, very importantly, because the new framework of how the biodiversity conservation, sustainable use, and access and benefit sharing, including financing that is being discussed, will have an impact. I have also put some suggestions, information on the Q&A chat box. Just one small example is on the mainstreaming of biodiversity in production sectors, which is being discussed under the CBD, the Convention on Biological Diversity's post-2020 Global Biodiversity Framework, which includes a discussion on energy, mining, besides agriculture. So once again, encouraging the group to also look at these very important linkages, including the financing that may come through the nature-based solutions. So I will keep it until there, and thank you very much for letting me have the space to present. Thank you.
Thank you very much for sharing those thoughts. I would like to now hand the floor to Jivika Shiv, who will speak on behalf of Global Youth and National Gender Youth Advocates to UN Women, and as a member of Mahila Kisan Adhikar Manch, National Women's Farmers Network in India. Jivika Shiv, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. I reiterate what Manoj and my fellow colleagues from Arrow and the Biodiversity Network said. I just want to additionally say, as part of the Global Youth who's been sending recommendations to governments as part of looking at the gendered nature of climate change, I just want to emphasize the role of young women, girls, and gender diverse youth, and the place at the decision-making table, especially of those from indigenous communities, high-risk communities, and those at the intersections of vulnerability and marginalization, and how are we bringing them into the decision-making spaces when we speak about climate change or disaster risk reduction. The second one I would like to also foreground as youth, building on the previous civil society speakers, would be the need to focus these into community knowledge and community initiatives, and also building these into looking at the human rights perspective on how to look at gendered responses to climate change, especially when we're looking at indigenous communities and rural women being at the most margins of these resources. The third is, as coming from one of the largest women farmers networks in India, I just want to foreground that most of our rural women across Asia are farmers. So when we look at any policy on climate change, on disaster risk reduction, and looking at its gendered aspect, I urge governments and other civil society partners to look at women farmers as a central process and look at it in the context of women and livelihoods, women and work, women in unpaid and paid, work that is unpaid care work and non-care work. Also look at how we can build for the most marginalized, whether it's forest dwellers, whether it is coasts, and also the increasing impact on young feminist activists who are speaking about climate change and human rights and a criminalization, including people like Disha Ravi from our country, how we can look at creating more safe spaces for the discourse on climate change for youth. Thank you very, very much.
Thank you very much for sharing that. Before we close this session, I would like to check whether there are any other requests for the floor. Please indicate in the chat. I see one more request. I would like to hand the floor to Muriel Watts, Pan Asia Pacific.
Thank you very much. Kia ora koutou. My name is Muriel Watts. I'm the Director of Science and Policy at Pan Asia Pacific, based in Malaysia, but I'm speaking from Aotearoa, New Zealand. Pan-Asia Pacific is concerned about the impact of climate change on farming in Asia and the Pacific, and particularly on the health and well-being of those involved in it. The acute pesticide poisoning of farmers and farm workers in Asia is already a disaster. Of the estimated 11,000 deaths from unintentional acute pesticide poisoning globally every year, 86% occur in Asia. With regard to non-fatal pesticide poisoning, globally 44% of farmers and farm workers are poisoned per annum, but this rises to 51% in Southeast Asia and 64.75% in South Asia. These figures are for men, women, and children. We do not know how many of them are women, and we have no data at all for the Pacific. But we do know that climate change is likely to make this disaster even worse unless there is concerted effort by governments in the region to phase out the most hazardous pesticides and to assist farmers, and especially women farmers, to shift to agroecology, which increases climate resilience and preserves biodiversity, as well as drastically reducing the poisoning disaster. I will put the source of the data I've just cited in the chat box. Thank you very much.
Kia ora, Muriel, and thank you very much for your intervention. With many thanks and much appreciation for all the interventions this morning, I would like, sorry, we have one more speaker before we close. I would like to give the floor to Ramona Miranda from Duriog Navaran. Ramona, the floor is yours.
Partnerships were mentioned in this, thanks Brandon, thanks all. Partnerships were mentioned in the panel discussion as being important. And I find this consultation in itself as a case in point where in partnership, various UN agencies are looking at multiple agendas together. And similarly, I think partnerships within governments across subject ministries is also crucial if we are to achieve gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental and DRR policies and programs, as well as enable women to become actors of this transformative change that we're talking about at the national and local levels. We've carried out a recent review, I'll post it in the chat, which outlines a set of recommendations towards this. But this discussion also talked about the capacity to engage women as being that the capacity to of women to engage in development in technology is very evident, but the space to access that capacity is limited by several factors, including the recognition of that capacity and the work that's already carried out by women. So evidence collection is one example of actions that needs to happen. Evidence collection and actions that highlight key issues of women's resilience and the requirements for investing in resilience building through agenda analysis is paramount in this context. There are other recommendations that can be accessed from that. Thanks, Brandman, for the space and time.
Many thanks, Ramona. And with this, we will bring this session to a close. I would like to sincerely thank all of the presenters and panelists and the very rich and concise interventions from speakers during the plenary discussion. I am pleased now to hand back to Shane. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Ms. Miller, and thank you very much, Mr. Lam, as well, for very ably moderating this segment of our program. Thank you to all our panelists as well, and may I just echo the appreciation of Ms. Miller for all the participants who gave remarks during the plenary discussion. So we are running ahead of our program. We will take a short break for the next 10 minutes before returning for a review of the recommendations and closing of this consultation. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back. I now have the pleasure of introducing the moderators for our final session, Dr. Srinivas Tata and Ms. Sarah Nips. Dr. Tata is the Director of the Social Development Divisions at the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, and Ms. Nips is the officer in charge for the UN Women Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Without further ado, may I please hand over to Dr. Tata, please? The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Shani. Distinguished representatives from governments, civil society partners, colleagues from the United Nations family, and friends. It is my distinct pleasure to join you today at the Asia-Pacific Regional Consultations on the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. Together with my colleague, Sarah, I am pleased to welcome you to the fourth and final session that will review the recommendations by session and will hear contributions made in plenary to those recommendations. I would first of all like to extend a big thank you to all participants, panelists, and moderators for engaging in these insightful discussions on both the status quo as well as the best ways to fast forward really equitable action on climate action, that is, to address climate change. From the first session, we now better understand the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters, along with the nexus of women's unpaid care and domestic work, gender-based violence, migration and displacement, including measures that strengthen mitigation, response, and adaptation within these contexts. The subsequent sessions made clear the importance of women as actors when affecting regional and gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. I was particularly heartened to hear of the promising practices and examples of progressive policies that were shared. We need more of these to advance gender equality within the context of climate change, and we need them now. I'm therefore very much looking forward to this session, in particular, where we'll review the recommendations by session and to hear your overall reflections and insights. The recommendations, as you know, will feed into the CSW66 discussions. It can also build capacity for membership contribution to the agreed conclusions of the CSW. They will also support us in creating a more equal future for women and girls in our region, and in order to ensure that no one is left behind. And this in turn will help us meet our 2030 ambitions while hopefully charting the path of progress towards climate action in Asia and the Pacific. Please note that the recommendations will form part of the meeting report, and we will circulate a draft report for your review and feedback after the conclusion of the consultations. I will now hand over to my colleague, Sarah Nitz, who will invite the co-leads for the UN system to present the recommendations. Over to you, Sarah.
Thank you so much, Dr. Tata, for introducing the focus of our session this morning. So distinguished delegates, ladies and gentlemen, good morning and good afternoon. As mentioned already, I'm Sarah Nibs, and I'm the officer in charge of UN Women's Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. I have the pleasure to co-moderate the session this morning, that we are reviewing the recommendations that have emanated from the 3 sessions that were held yesterday and today. I would like to thank all of you again for your continued engagement, and I really encourage you to continue to engage during this session. We'll kick off with a presentation of the recommendations by session, following which we will look forward to your contributions on the same topic on a rolling basis. In terms of contributions to the recommendations, we'll be inviting additions to the recommendations that have been presented, but we kindly request that you limit your interventions to 2 to 3 minutes to allow an opportunity to hear from as many participants as we can accommodate. And as Dr. Tata has already mentioned, we will also be circulating the recommendations afterwards, so there will be an opportunity again to comment on the exact expression of the text. So before I open the floor to you all, I want to invite our 3 distinguished moderators of the panels to share their session's recommendations. Each of you will have 7 minutes to give us your presentations, and we invite you to have the opportunity to listen to those. So to begin with, for session 1, which was on understanding the gendered impacts of climate change, environment degradation and disasters, I would like to welcome Tomoko Kurokawa, who is the Humanitarian Advisor of the United Nations Population Fund UNFPA Regional Office for Asia and the Pacific. Tomoko, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much. And good morning, good afternoon, colleagues. It is my great privilege to represent the collective voices of all who have contributed to the Asia Pacific Regional Consultation and to present the key recommendations for session 1, where the overarching objective is to understand the gendered impacts of climate change, environment, degradation, and disasters, and to ensure women's equality and the realization of their human rights through the alignment of policies, laws, and regulations on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction with international and regional frameworks, including the 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Sustainable Development Goals, the Beijing Declaration and Platform for Action, the Paris Agreement on Climate Change, and the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction. The recommendations for session 1 are highlighted through 2 pillars. The first pillar is on strengthening the linkage between gender, climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction interventions, both policy and programmatic, and broader social, economic, cultural, and political frameworks. The first recommendation is to promote an intersectional lens in national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, national climate change frameworks, and other national policies, acknowledging the factors of class, race, ethnicity, sex, age, ability, and geographical location that influence the differentiated impacts of climate and disaster risks experienced by vulnerable population groups and locations, especially small island developing states. To ensure that climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction are linked to broader social, economic, cultural, and political frameworks, including issues on human mobility, in order to ensure gender responsive and inclusive action. To recognize the role of women's unpaid care and domestic work, including its exacerbation when having to respond to the impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters, through the creation of policies that value, reward, reduce, and redistribute unpaid care and domestic work, and ensure the participation of unpaid care and domestic workers in policy dialogues. To recognize the role of women in sustainable resource governance and biodiversity conservation, contributing to climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction interventions. Noting the impact of climate change and disasters on women's health and well-being, to ensure that health systems, including the health workforce, are strengthened to ensure access to and availability of sexual and reproductive health services, as well as mental health and psychosocial support during and after disasters. To recognize the importance of women's advancement and participation in the workforce in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics, to have meaningful participation in the implementation of solutions and designs for climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction interventions. Next slide, please. To ensure that policies and programs to address climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters promote and protect human rights related to gender equality, including reproductive rights, in line with the program of action of the International Conference on Population and Development and the Beijing Platform for Action. To ensure the voice and meaningful representation of women in all their diversity in policy and decision-making processes, to build collaboration between women's and youth organizations, organizations for persons with disabilities, as well as environmental groups, including those at the grassroots and community level, to work with states in policy design and monitoring. To strengthen the technical capacity of subnational mechanisms for inclusive and gender-responsive action to climate change, environmental degradation, and disaster risk reduction, to promote women's equality and empowerment. To recognize that in many contexts, women are reliant upon natural resources for financial security, which is impacted directly as a result of climate change and disasters, requiring anticipatory instruments such as forecast-based financing mechanisms and shock-responsive social safety nets that are based on a thorough assessment of existing gender inequalities, as well as investment in alternative income generation and financial stability. noting that decreased access to resources and income may have a direct impact on access to essential services and education for women and girls, reinforcing cycles of poverty, gender-based violence and harmful practices, including child marriage. To have policies and programs which span all sectors and services is critical. To ensure and expand commitment to adequate gender and climate justice financing by governments and stakeholders, including mechanisms to address loss and damage. Now for the second pillar, next slide, please. For the second pillar on improving data availability on the gendered risks and impacts of climate change, environment degradation, and disasters, to enhance inclusive and gender responsive policy development and programming, the key recommendations are to expand data collection and analysis of sex, age, and disability disaggregated data to understand the impacts of climate change and disasters using quantitative and qualitative methods to understand the lived experiences of women and other affected populations to inform evidence-based action, to strengthen data literacy and analysis in areas of existing gender inequalities, such as unpaid care work, sexual and reproductive health, gender-based violence and harmful practices, including child marriage, access to resources, and migration. To ensure that national and local disaster risk reduction strategies, national climate change adaptation plans, and other national policies and programs for sustainable development include indicators to monitor the impacts on women's equality and empowerment. To promote collaboration between women's ministries, ministries of health, and the ministries that govern climate change, disaster risk management, and environmental management by sharing responsibility for data collection and reporting between the ministries. And finally, to continue to promote and support increased capacity to collect, analyze, and use data to inform policies and programs and to reduce disaster risk. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Tomoko. Now we will turn to session 2, which was on regional and national gender transformative policies on climate change, environment, and disaster risk reduction. And for this one, I'd like to welcome my colleague, Maria Holzberg, who is the Regional Advisor for Humanitarian Action and DRR of UN Women, Regional Office, Asia and the Pacific. Maria, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nibs, and thank you very much to my colleague Tomoko for an excellent overview of session 1. I have the pleasure to outline some of the recommendations for session 2, which focused on the regional, national, gender transformative policies. And I will also look at this from three pillars. So the first pillar is on demonstrating strong political commitment by carrying out concrete actions. And we will look at those actions in the recommendations, guided by the acknowledgement of the rights and needs and priorities of women and marginalized groups. So within this pillar, we have recommendations. The first one is utilizing a gender responsive and intersectional approach to the policy process by guaranteeing meaningful and sustained engagement of feminist, women-led, youth-led, LGBTQIA networks and organizations. And this also includes Indigenous women, environmental defenders, as well as grassroots communities. So what we want to ensure here is a bottom-up approach. Actively transform harmful gender norms by promoting women's leadership in climate change, disaster risk reduction, conservation, and sustainable use of biodiversity, and institutionalizing policy changes. Strengthen policy coherence and the integration of gender and human rights across development, climate, DRR, and environment policies established by gender frameworks or action plans of multilateral environmental agreements. Some of those policies may be nationally determined contributions, so NDCs, national adaptation plans, NAPs, national biodiversity strategies and action plans, and disaster risk reduction plans. Those are some of the examples. Ensure evidence-driven decision-making informed by gender data and anchored in an intersectional analysis of compounded risks due to the worsening impacts of the COVID-19 pandemic, climate change, disaster, environmental degradation on critical sectors. And these include food, agricultural, water, sanitation, energy, and on gender equality. Mobilize adequate financial and human resources to drive risk-informed development and implement gender responsive and environmental, climate and environmental action. Ensure a whole of society approach through adaptive subnational, national, and regional governance mechanisms linking ministries within country, as well as working in partnership with donors, financial institutions, and civil society organizations that work across humanitarian, disaster, and development settings. Ensure that representation of the Women Affairs Ministry in decision-making spaces related to climate, disasters, and the environment. Strengthen capacities on gender mainstreaming and adopt collaborative learning strategies at both the regional and national level for governments and civil society. The second pillar is focused on establish a comprehensive monitoring and accountability framework to evaluate outcomes as a result of the integration of gender equality into climate, disaster, environment, and other related sectors. And you will see some synergies with the recommendations from this session with what was previously reported from my colleague Tomoko. The recommendations are as follows. Develop a harmonized set of gender, environment, and disaster-related indicators and accompanying database to systematically track gender outcomes of disaster risk reduction, climate change, and environmental policies. That also prioritize the collection, analysis, and use of gender data to inform policy processes. And this also promotes a strong engagement between national statistics offices, government ministries, civil society, and other key users of data. Improve the tracking and reporting of international and national climate finance flows, including local climate expenditures, and evaluate the impact on gender equality and the adaptive capacity of women, community, and at-risk groups. And finally, in this pillar, ensure that review and stock-taking exercises of international policy frameworks, including the Sendai Framework for Disaster Risk Reduction, Paris Agreement, Water Action Decade 2018 to 2028, and their respective gender action plans are gender responsive. The last pillar for this session is focused on transform social, economic, and financial systems to achieve resilient and sustainable development. And there's 3 recommendations here. Leveraging the COVID-19 recovery to build ecological sustainability, long-term resilience, and the adaptive capacities of women and communities. And this is achieved through strengthening of comprehensive shock responsive social protection mechanisms, investing in gender responsive infrastructure, and actively supporting women's economic empowerment. We also recommend strengthen partnerships between government, private sector, and local and international financing institutions to bolster innovation and gender responsive investments to facilitate the effective implementation of national and regional climate, disaster, and environment policies. And finally, the final recommendation, increase accountability through enhancing governance mechanisms and promoting the rule of law that provides protection and redress mechanisms for women and the most disadvantaged sectors affected by climate change and disaster impacts. Thank you very much. Back over to you.
Thank you very much, Maria, for that. And finally, we will turn to session 3, which is on women as actors of climate change, environment management, and disaster risk reduction. And for this one, I would like to welcome Branwen Miller, who is the Gender Advisor of UNDRR. Branwen, over to you. The floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Sarah. Distinguished guests, it's an honor to share with you the recommendations from session 3 on women as actors of climate change, environment management, and disaster risk reduction. As this session has just concluded, we have had limited time to fully capture the richness of your discussions, and comments on the recommendations will be welcomed. Session 3 recognized the vital role that women in all their diversity play at the center of climate change adaptation, environment management, and disaster risk reduction, and highlighted the need to promote and support their full, meaningful, and equitable participation and leadership in climate action, environment, and risk-related decision-making. As such, the first set of recommendations emphasizes the need to value, promote, and amplify women's voices, agency, participation, and leadership. And in particular, ensure the full, equal, and meaningful participation and leadership of women at all levels of climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction governance, including in national institutions and delegations to decision-making forums, with particular attention given to enabling the participation of young women and youth and ensuring participation at the local level, so that women and young women are not only viewed as users of resources, but managers of resources. Leverage the participation and influence of women in managing the conservation and sustainable use of natural resources, including in conflict and crisis-affected settings, recognizing the diverse roles played by women, including as small-scale farmers, pastoralists, and fishers in integrated governance, as well as Indigenous and local community tenure and governance models. Recognize and promote women's roles in biodiversity conservation and sustainable agri-food systems by developing policies and programs that foster rural women's economic empowerment and access and control over productive resources, and enables their engagement in sustainable food production that restores biodiversity, regenerates the agro-ecosystem, and provides resilience against climate change and disaster risks. Develop comparable national baselines based on qualitative and quantitative analyses of the involvement of women, women's organizations, and gender equality mechanisms in the climate, environment, and disaster institutions for monitoring over time. Promote and protect the rights of women environmental human rights defenders, and ensure that violations and abuses against them are investigated and that those responsible are held accountable in line with global and regional agreements. Strengthen the capacity and engagement of national gender equality mechanisms at all levels with sustainable and adequate funding, and promote intragovernmental coordination mechanisms that ensure the meaningful participation of gender ministries and women's organizations in the design, delivery, and evaluation of all key national policy processes and programs for risk-informed sustainable development to ensure gender mainstreaming in policies and planning processes. And finally, engage directly with women's organizations in climate change adaptation and disaster risk reduction as key element of localization, and work with local women's organizations and networks to empower and strengthen their capacities as advocates and innovators, forging common space for interaction, dialogue, and building alliances for feminist collective action. Next slide, please. The second set of recommendations emphasize the need to support, invest in, and utilize women's knowledge, skills, and capacities, including promoting lifelong learning, training, and education, including in science, technology, engineering, and mathematics for women and girls, and create pathways and opportunities for women to enter skilled trades and jobs, including in the sustainable energy sector. Leverage the ancestral knowledge and practices of Indigenous peoples and local communities for gender responsive climate change adaptation, biodiversity conservation, and sustainable use and disaster risk reduction. Invest in building the capacities of women, Indigenous people, and other marginalized groups and their organizations to enhance their leadership and negotiation skills, and equally invest in the capacity building of government officials to raise awareness on gender mainstreaming and the gender and climate environment disaster nexus. Increase the share of climate, environment, and disaster risk finance that also supports gender equality outcomes and include dedicated budgets that focus on gender equality as a specific outcome of climate and environment investments. Strengthen the resilience of women and girls to climate and disaster risk through the financing and provision of sustainable infrastructure and public services, adaptive social protection, and decent work for women. Protect and expand eligibility and access to climate, environmental, and disaster finance mechanisms, including through grants with preferential access for women's organizations. And finally, increase public and private financing to women's organizations and enterprises for climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction initiatives by repurposing environmentally harmful subsidies for fossil fuels and agriculture to finance policies and programs that strengthen the resilience of women and girls to climate change, environmental degradation and disasters, and prioritize investments in women-owned or women-led micro, small, and medium enterprises, particularly in sectors that promote disaster, climate resilient agriculture and agroecology, decentralized sustainable energy, and other sustainability enterprises. Many thanks for your time, and Sarah, I hand the floor back to you.
Thank you very much, Branwen. So I'd like to thank once again the three presenters, Tomoko, Maria, and Branwen. This brings us to the end of the presentations, but I would like to ask the presenters to please remain with us to be able to capture additional recommendations that emanate from the floor, and also to support us with any follow-up questions that may come. I may come back to you during the moderated plenary session that we're going into now. So, dear delegates, I would now like to invite interventions from the virtual floor, and these should please be shared. These should please be requested via the chat box, similar to the previous sessions of this gathering. We would like to once again request that interventions please not exceed 2 minutes. And I would like to begin by inviting individual government representatives to share their contributions to the recommendations. Thereafter, we will invite non-governmental stakeholders and actors to share their perspectives and interventions. I should also just share, I'm sorry, that we will be compiling the recommendations and to reiterate that those will be shared in the report of the consultations with all of you by the 28th of February. And this will help to inform contributions from this region to the agreed conclusions during the CSW66, which will commence on the 14th of March 2022. So with that reminder, I would like to open the floor now for contributions and to request, please, when you ask to take the floor, if you could indicate if there's a specific session, 1, 2, or 3, which your intervention is addressed to, so that we can ensure that we accurately capture and place your inputs. We will also welcome written inputs via the chat. And again, please indicate where you would like your input to fit in with the 3 sessions recommendations. So thank you so much, delegates. And I'd like to invite those of you who'd like to speak to indicate for us in the chat, please.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Nibs, for giving me the floor. This is Geng Yun, Assistant Permanent Representative of China to ESCAP. First of all, good morning and good afternoon, good evening to all the participants from different time zones. And I would like to thank all the speakers this morning for their very insightful comments and ideas. I would also like to thank all the organizers for this event and for their efforts in compiling these recommendations for the 3 substantive sessions. About the recommendations for session 1, we would like to add 1 point because we believe we should not lose sight to the importance of development in promoting women's resilience to deal with disasters, climate change, and environment degradation. So we believe that development should be put as the priority to help more women and girls out of poverty and achieve economic independence so as to guarantee stronger capacity and resilience against climate-related disasters. And I will also put my written comments in the chat box or send it by email to the Secretariat for your ease of reference. And we hope our proposal or suggestion could be reflected in the final recommendations. Thank you.
So I would like to see that we have a request from the delegate from Bangladesh. So delegate from Bangladesh, the floor is yours. Over to you.
Thank you very much for the ESCAP authorities for conducting a very nice 2 days workshop, a seminar, something. I just want to point it out in focusing on 2 areas in a nutshell. Regarding the poverty, the low-lying countries of the Asia Pacific Oceans countries and like Bangladesh, Maldives, etc., are the most affected countries. All of us know. So the scenario of poverty will be degraded day by day. So we have to combat regarding this poverty. I would suggest to take a recommendation to enhance the social safety net programs for the women, number 1, and number 2. Can we think of about introduction of a preferential treatment for the developing countries like Bangladesh and other countries who will be suffering and who are suffering, to international community to come up forward with a view to give them a preferential treatment in terms of any kind of assistance, particularly in trade and commerce. So maintaining these preferential systems and enhance this preferential treatment to this kind of countries. This too is my recommendation. You could think of about it. Thank you very much.
I think we had, okay, I see that we have Maria Galario from ISCSC Philippines. I would like to give you the floor. Over to you.
Good afternoon. The Institute for Climate and Sustainable Cities, an international climate and energy group based here in Manila, believes that women and girls constituting half the world hold on top solutions to climate crisis. And as such, when and if they are empowered and able. In the context of vulnerable countries or where we are working, especially in island nations, that on an annual basis are often most affected by intense extreme weather events that are being supercharged by climate change. The ability of frontliners and humanitarians to respond and deliver emergency life-saving needs are often hampered by lack of energy, as critical energy infrastructure are among the first infrastructure that are being destroyed. Often isolation becomes a consequence, especially when power that runs emergency communication lines also gets depleted. As such, it is imperative that as an integral part of empowering disaster and humanitarian responses in the context of climate change, integration of renewable energy and clean fuels be part of the critical arsenal or tools for disaster preparedness and response, especially by women agencies as climate adaptation approach. More so, in line with international efforts such as safe access to fuel and energy, access to energy, especially for affected women and girls, be a priority in protection of women and girls' spaces, wash, food and emergency shelter, and in information camps. In line with this, our recommendation is to in session 3, bullet 5, our suggestion to add in the text accelerating access to decentralized renewable energy and safe fuel before that word infrastructure. Thank you.
Thank you very much, and we take note of your contributions. I would like to next invite Chris Richter, who is the Regional Migration Environment Climate Change Specialist from the Regional Office of IOM, and who has registered an interest to speak. So Chris, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, and good morning, colleagues. And first of all, congratulations to the organizers of this event for a very interesting couple of days. I just wanted to quickly intervene to sort of reiterate our call for discussions on the gendered impacts of climate change, environmental degradation, and disasters induced by natural hazards, to also address connections with human mobility. With numerous reports consistently highlighting that the Asia Pacific region is particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change and to disasters and so on, the potential for increased human mobility is likely. And this makes it essential to undertake gender-specific analysis of migration and its interactions with climate and environmental factors in order to understand the specific roles played by women and men in their socio-cultural context, and to better discern the different ways in which they are affected by climate and environmental events. And so, as mentioned in the sessions yesterday, IOM hopes that the outcomes of this consultation and the upcoming CSW will include recommendations to highlight the need to assess human mobility and its connections with gender, climate change, and other environmental factors, and also to draw linkages with other ongoing processes to which these issues are relevant, including the International Migration Review Forum, the Global Platform for Disaster Risk Reduction, and COP27. And we stand ready to support this process further and look forward to a productive CSW in New York. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much indeed, Chris. I'd also like to really appreciate the government delegates who had technical issues for sharing your comments in the chat, and they've been noted and they will be included. Thank you very much. So I would just once again like to just check if there are any other non-government actors and stakeholders who would like to come in from the floor. Please let us know in the chat if you would be interested to do so. Okay, I think we have a request here from one of our participants, Quasi Baby. I'm going to give you the floor, and please let us know the organization as well when you come in. Thank you very much. The floor is yours.
I'm Quasi Baby from Bangladesh. And I'm the member of FIRO Commission. So you know, we are mainly working with the grassroots women. So the grassroots women are working mainly with the community resilience. So disaster also an issue, how they can cope the disaster issue. So the community resilience, if they want to make the community resilience, then the leadership is very important. So if we are able to provide leadership training for the women, the grassroots women, then the community will be developed, especially the coastal area. Those who are the disaster area, disaster prone area in Bangladesh. But that scope we are not getting. Women are trying their best, but they are not working with the grassroots people, grassroots women. So it is very important. So I want to highlight this issue and how we can get this opportunity to make partnership through the ESCAP or other organization. Thank you.
Thank you very much indeed for your intervention, and we've taken note of the points that you shared. So it seems from the chat that at the moment we don't have any other colleagues who wish to take the floor. So I want to just once again reiterate all of the comments that have come to us in the chat were taken into account and taken note of, and will be included. So thank you very much to those of you who either weren't able to speak or have put your comments in writing. So I would just like to round up by thanking our three presenters for capturing the inputs from the floor in the different sessions, and for bringing together the tabled recommendations. As I've already mentioned, these recommendations will be reflected in the report on the consultation and will be shared with you next week. And so there will again be an opportunity to all of you to review those. And they will be very important in informing the region's inputs to the CSW66 agreed conclusions that we will have coming out of the Commission on the Status of Women 66 in March. So I would like to just once again thank our distinguished delegates and participants for your very rich contributions to make these regional consultations a success. And I want to appreciate ESCAP once again, and our partners and our UN partners, UNDP, UNDRR, UNEP, UNFPA, and Unicef. And I would like to now hand back to Chane. Chane, over to you.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nips, and thank you again. Let me echo the appreciation of Ms. Nips to all of the UN entities who assisted in compiling these recommendations, and thank you to all of the government, intergovernmental organizations, and civil society organizations representatives for providing your contributions. Before moving this session to a close, we would like to take this opportunity to invite you to complete the electronic evaluation questionnaire. The link is going to be shared in the chat box just now, and it won't take any longer than 3 minutes to complete. So we kindly ask for your assistance to improving our future meetings to complete the evaluation after the meeting ends. And we thank you very much in advance for your support on this. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, as we draw this two-day regional consultation to a close, we will now have our closing remarks already delivered by Ms. Nips, and it is therefore now my honor to invite Dr. Srinivas Tata, Director of the Social Development Division of the United Nations Economic and Social Commission for Asia and the Pacific, to deliver his opening remarks. Dr. Tata, please, the floor is yours.
It'll only be my closing remarks, Rani. It's been a wonderful, long meeting. Distinguished representatives, civil society partners, colleagues from the United Nations family, and friends. On behalf of of ESCAP and UN Women, my colleague, the Regional Director EI of UN Women, Sarah Nips, it is my honor to close this regional consultation on the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. I'd like to thank all the speakers and participants for sharing your insights on achieving gender equality and the empowerment of all women and girls in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. I would also like to extend our sincere thanks to the session moderators for facilitating these highly constructive discussions. The Asia-Pacific region faces unique challenges in terms of disaster and climate change risks. However, throughout this consultation, we have heard of promising practices and achievements that governments and civil society have implemented towards achieving equality and empowerment of women and girls despite these challenging contexts. The proposed recommendations, which we presented to you in brief, which we will circulate to you, like Sarah says, and we highlight the urgent need to build on the growing momentum around climate change action and ensure that women and girls are at the center of the response. We discussed the need to transform existing social, economic, and financial systems to achieve women and girls empowerment and equality within resilient and sustainable development. The recommendations also refer to the need to build cooperation between all relevant ministries and including those of gender, climate change, environmental, and disaster risk reduction. We discussed the importance of establishing a comprehensive monitoring and accountability framework to assess the impact on women and girls of new policies and programs. In all of these decisions, we need to involve women and decision makers at the table, and this was stressed as a key to the success of any policy or program. I'm confident that member states will be able to take away from this meeting new ideas as to how rights, needs, and priorities of women and girls can be integrated into climate change and environmental and disaster risk reduction policies and programs. We need to ensure that no one is left behind in our response to these immense challenges and work towards empowerment and equality for all women and girls in Asia and the Pacific. Before I finish, I have the great job, and it's always good when you have wonderful teams working with us. And I'd like to firstly recognize the work conducted by all government representatives, key stakeholders, our UN partners towards this meeting and in spurring progressive policy and agendas towards achieving gender equality in the context of climate change, environmental and disaster risk reduction. In addition, we also need to combat the gender norms hidden in the infrastructure of many of our societies. The work today will help us to engineer an inclusive post-COVID recovery and support us in meeting our 2030 ambitions on gender equality and climate action within Asia and the Pacific. On behalf, again, I'd like to thank the teams from UN Women as well as ESCAP who put together this really wonderful meeting. We have the level of engagement. We had almost 200 people engaged in this meeting throughout, even now. As you can see, there are more than 160 people logged on, which shows the level of involvement, the interest, and the importance of what we are discussing today. I'd also like to thank our partners, UNDP, UNDRR, UNFPA, Unicef, and UNEP, for really working together as one team towards the success of this consultation. And I would also like to express my appreciation to the teams involved right across UN entities, and once again to all participants from governments and civil society for your contribution. Without your contributions, we could have never had such an interesting meeting. So thank you very much. And I would like to also thank my co-moderator, Sarah, for our wonderful partnership and the way we have steered this meeting towards really meaningful conclusions. I hand the microphone back to the MC to close the meeting, please. Hannah, over to you.
Thank you very much, Dr. Tata, for your eloquent closing remarks. Excellencies, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, thank you again for joining us for this regional consultation on the priority theme of the 66th session of the Commission on the Status of Women. We hope you have found the discussions as insightful and fruitful as we have. We wish you a good rest of the day and bid you goodbye.